Yeah, hi everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this discussion on mental health and racism. For those of you who don't know, my name is Roxana and I'm an organizer here at Hope Not Hate. Apologies for the slightly nasal sound. I'm just recovering from a cold, so I'm going to try and do as little talking as possible, which is fine because you're not here to listen to me anyway. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our fantastic panel this evening. First, we have Azeem Rafiq, ex-Yorkshire player, anti-racism activist and MQ ambassador. We have Shaista Aziz, again, anti-racism campaigner, Hope Hero finalist and Oxford City Councillor. Third, we have Professor Anne John, Professor in Public Health and Psychiatry at Swansea University. And last but not least, Kevin George, former professional footballer and author of Psychology Inside the Hearts and Minds of Successful Professionals. So thank you for joining us. Before we get stuck into the discussion, just a few housekeeping bits. We will be recording this webinar and I'll be sending around a link after this event. So if you want to share, watch it back, please do that. If you'd like to tweet about the event, please use the hashtag #RunRacismOut. Also, please use the Q&A function that is available if you'd like to ask any of the panelists a question. I'll try and get to as many of them as possible at the end of the general discussion. And the chat box is also open if you'd like to introduce yourself to the other attendees, share any thoughts and reflections. That is really, really encouraged. So enough of me talking, let's kick things off. First, I'd like to go to Professor Anne John. You do a lot of quantitative research on the relationship between discrimination and mental health. Could you speak to some of this work you've done, as I think it will make a really good foundation for the rest of the discussion?
Thanks, Roxana, and thanks for inviting me. So we've had evidence on ethnicity and mental health inequalities for a while, and those inequalities are in opportunity, like how you access mental health care that can be problematic, but also in outcomes like how recovery and treatment. Most of this research is based on the experiences of people with what we call severe mental illness, so like those with psychosis, and people from ethnic minorities, especially Black people or those with Afro-Caribbean backgrounds, experience what we call coercive care pathways. So whereas most of us, when we might have a mental health problem, might go to our GP, with people from ethnic minority backgrounds, those pathways are often through the criminal justice system, with the police, or with use of the Mental Health Act, with involuntary admission or treatment. There's also less contact with primary care, and primary care is the service that might prevent those acute events, and also where you can have much more managed care by people who know you well. And when people attend emergency departments, they're less likely to see a mental health professional and less likely to get a psychiatric assessment than others with the same presenting complaint. So those are real issues. And while some of these inequalities might be from direct and overt racism, most are structural and institutional factors. And those are the sorts of factors that are most often contested by both society and institution, but they play a large part. So my research focuses very much on the wider determinants in mental health, so deprivation, poverty, employment, housing, education, substance use, and how these intersect. But ethnicity has been harder to do this sort of research on. And basically, COVID highlighted the health disparities for ethnic minority communities and uptake of things like vaccination. But it also highlighted what many of us already knew, and that was the recording of people's ethnicity is extremely poor in research and in health systems, even in the most crude terms. So I'm not talking even about things like which generation, first or second generation or third generation, or complex identities. just that basic recording is really poor. And what gets counted really matters, because it highlights need and it gives you the evidence to bring about change. So when the ethnicity is recorded, there's lots of use of the word other, which really feeds into that othering of people from ethnic minorities. People are hidden within the data and they have no voice in studies. And this is compounded by not being included or not participating in trials of interventions to manage mental health. And the consequence of that is that treatments, be they talking treatments or medicines, are not tailored to our communities. There are huge efforts to address this. Many journals are now asking you to report numbers from ethnic minorities. They're always surprisingly small. And funding councils are prioritising inclusion. So I do think COVID has made a difference. But because of all this, it's hardly surprising that the impact of racism on mental health is under-researched, let alone the impact of racism on mental health in sport. So there was a systematic review a few years ago that looked at about 2,000 studies of mental health in sport, and none of them included racism as an issue. So much of the existing evidence on mental health in sport is very medicalised. It's about diagnoses and symptoms. So, it focuses on eating disorders and stress and depression and self-esteem. And whereas what we really need to be thinking about is context. So there are issues in society with stigma in relation to mental health. And these can be heightened by stereotypes of masculinity that may be more likely in male-dominated environments, such as certain sports teams. And these act as a barrier to seeking help for mental health problems, but also as a barrier for how we respond. So we did a study looking at self-harm, and we found that, for the same complaint, boys were less likely to be admitted than girls with self-harm. So these are real issues that really impact on care. So sport includes this idea of resilience and mental toughness and endurance, and that's where that makes it quite difficult to disclose mental health problems. So we've got a way to go. Young men in teams at ages when peer relationships are paramount. We can demonstrate this on scans of people's brains, how important to young people their peers are. And that's really important in teams. And experiencing racism and exclusion from teammates, the chance of crowds simply when walking onto a pitch or on taking the knee, which is called a political gesture, when it's just as likely to be about lived experience, or racist abuse online, are very likely to have an impact on mental health. Work on mental health awareness in sport, as well as research, needs to put the sort of lived experience that we're going to hear about today at the centre, as we do in other mental health research. And I'm sure that's part of why Aziz is sort of an ambassador for MQ. It's really recognising the importance of understanding these mechanisms. So the place of racism as a cause of mental illness in society and institutions and systems is a conversation we need to have. And we need to have the research both to inform that conversation, but also prevent it from shutting down. So in the work that I do, which focuses particularly on suicidal behaviours and children and young people's mental health, things like thwarted belongingness, so not feeling like you belong, loneliness and bullying, are risk factors for mental health issues and suicidal behaviours. They're really strong risk factors that we can measure. It's not hard to see how racism could play a part in those underlying associations at all. I think the lack of evidence means those issues remain contested, and that's not okay, and that's absolutely something we need to address.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think I think that connection between macho culture and racism is a really interesting one, and something that yeah, I hope we can kind of look at towards the end of this discussion. And yeah, just from what you were saying about the importance of centering lived experiences, I think I'd like to move on to Azeem next. I'm sure many of you will have heard about his experiences of racism while at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. But Azeem, I was just wondering if you could give us a brief timeline of what happened while you were at Yorkshire.
Thanks for inviting me. Just a brief timeline. I moved to the UK from Pakistan, played for Yorkshire over a number of years during 2 spells from 2008 to 14 and then 2016 to 18. Throughout my time at Yorkshire, I struggled a lot mentally. From as early as 2013, I was prescribed medication, and it's something I relied on. I knew something wasn't right, but right till the end, I didn't really know what it was that was affecting me so much. And then, yeah, I spoke out. It became very evident towards the end of my time what it was that was affecting me so much that I was struggling to sleep, that what Professor Hans just said, struggling to eat, my eating habits, and everything was just all over the place. And then building up the courage to speak out in 2020. And then, yeah, it's just been a whirlwind of a couple of years now, but it just feels like never ending. And I think the constant hammer at your health is hard to describe, to be honest. I don't know at times how I get through it. A certain day, I don't know how I sleep at times, and it's challenging, and it's affected me immensely. Obviously, I've spoken to you several times about it. There's weeks and days where it feels like it's better to end it, but yeah, I think that's a pretty brief timeline.
Yeah, thank you for that. And just to kind of echo what you touched on there, I think it's so commendable what you've done, and in the in the face of such kind of big structural powers kind of working against you, it's just I really respect you, but also I really appreciate the toll that's taken, not only on you but on your family as well. So it's been huge. I guess what also kind of happened to you in terms of the racism you face kind of brought up a lot of conversations about racial gaslighting and microaggressions. And then obviously subsequently not to have been believed, or for it to be brushed off as banter. What effect did that have on you?
Huge. I think I went into it looking for answers. It was an interview about my new business. I got emotional and I said everything. And then I genuinely expected a phone call to get in a room, sit and talk it through, and try and work out a way that it wasn't going to happen again. But the gaslighting, the constant discrediting, attacking my character, and I was pretty clear from the word go that I wasn't a perfect human being. I wish I'd made this a little bit clearer. There's no way I sat there at DCMS and tried to say, look, I'm perfect, everyone else is not. All I was just trying to say is like how I went into that environment, what I was, and how slowly the toll it started to take on me, and it changed my own behaviors. I wanted to fit in to that team culture, that again, some of the things Professor talked about there, that mental toughness, that male environment, and you want to fit in, because for you to perform individually, if you don't fit in within the team, it's really difficult. So all of that, but then just not to be believed, lot of attempts made to intimidate me and that made me even more determined. And as well, it's a bit sad because they clearly never got to know me, because if they'd have dealt me with love, I'll melt in a second, it will end. And that, I hope, has been very clear. But if people want to fight, I'm very determined. It took me right to the brink. And I don't think I quite realize how much I struggle at times until I talk about it. Like, even I was at a speaking event a couple of weeks ago, and it really, it really dawned down on me how much I'm still struggling. And it is difficult every time, but I'm pretty determined. I feel like I've been handed a responsibility, not through choice, and something a lot of people do get in touch with me with some sort of hope. The same way I got in touch with people with hope, I felt like I was incredibly let down. I don't want to do that to other people. So I think as difficult as it continues to be for me, and the next few months will be, it's something that I'm pretty passionate about. And I've got 2 kids, 2 and 1. There's no way I want them to have the mental scars that I've got.
No, I mean, 100%. I mean, you're trying to create change for, the next generations of people, not only coming up through the cricketing world, but, society in general. And, that's why activism like yours is so important. You touched on it just at the beginning of that second question about that kind of macho culture and the kind of the locker room culture as well. Could you just speak to that a bit? What was that like for you? And, do you see a change happening already, or, do we still have a long way to go on that space?
Yeah, I think we've got a hell of a long way to go. I can talk about from a cricketing point of view, even recently, that nothing makes me believe that actually cricket or sporting environments see this as a problem. They want to make me out to be the problem, and that's fine. They can try that, but facts are facts. This is just not Azeem Rafiq's experience. This is a lot of people's experience within cricket and other sports and society in general. But a lot of people have spoken out after me, and I know a lot more were going to, but due to the attacks that came my way, have been scared and put off. But yeah, look, I think there's a long way to go. The first thing cricket can do is actually accept that there's a problem and things need to be different. This sort of macho environment of mental, this is the thing I've spoke about all the time. I don't agree with this, or you've got to pump your chest out to show that you're mentally tough, or you've got to show confidence. I don't agree with that stuff, actually, because that's all bravado anyway. But what it leads to is people, and generally you've got kids coming into the environment. So when I went into that environment, I was a kid, but I watched behaviors by others and thought that was the way that I had to behave to be able to achieve my dream. And that's got to stop. And to do that, I think right from the top, in terms of cricket, ECB needs to tackle it with a bit more braveness. I think we've seen action plans and stuff, as we always do. But to this stage, we haven't seen action. The game needs to let more people into it, to give them a wider perspective. I feel like cricket is such a small sport, and it doesn't want to let people in and views in from the outside. There's some incredible people all who can help drive the game in a better direction, but the game is very protective of itself. And I think till that barrier drops, I don't think we will see change.
Yeah, no, there's only so many 12-point plans you can have before you don't believe they're taking it seriously. But yeah, thank you so much for that, Azeem, and fingers crossed we can do some good change in cricket and in sport in general. I'm just going to move on to Shaista next. Shaista, you've been working on the topic of racism in sport for a while now, both through the 3 hijabis and your own activism, and you've also been a fantastic ally to Azeem during his case as well. Most recently, you've been looking at the hijab ban in French football. Could you tell us a bit about what you've been doing there?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks to you, Roxana, and Hope Not Hate for organising this panel. I think this issue is really, really important, and we definitely need to talk about this and to make sure that people know it, that we have safe spaces where we can have these discussions. And also just want to thank the panel for their work, and especially you, Azeem, to have to keep reliving your experience is very triggering. And what you've managed to do so far is absolutely phenomenal. And I just wanted you to know that when I was watching you give evidence, like many people across the country watching you give evidence, it was so painful to hear your experiences, and to also see that all-white panel kind of just watching your face as you were talking. And so I wrote a piece for The Guardian about this. So I talked about how your experiences being able to actually speak truth to power mirrors a lot of what's going on in this country in workplaces. You know, when we're going to HR as people of color, when we're going to other, you know, bosses and, you know, all of that, and we just met with a wall of whiteness and people just watching as we are left to share our pain. And so, yeah, so your words and the way you carried yourself and the way you continue to do so, as you know, is very powerful. And I know that comes at really high personal cost to you, but I do want to thank you. So yeah, I've been looking at France's attempts to ban the hijab in sport. So we know that France is, over a number of years, has made it very, very difficult, indeed illegal, for Muslim women to wear any clothing which can identify them as Muslim. They say this is because they believe in the right to secularism. After the Charlie Hebdo massacre, I spent quite a lot of time in Paris and other parts of France, where I made a documentary for the BBC. And the documentary was looking at what it means to be young French and Muslim. And as I was going about making this documentary, I had really incredible access. I went to the French Parliament. I interviewed Marine Le Pen. Obviously, when I went to interview her, at no point did I tell her I wear a hijab. So that itself was very interesting. When I showed up at Parliament, I was told I couldn't enter the building because of my headscarf. So I had to tell them, well, I'm British. And actually, I said to them, I'm as British as fish and chips. True story that they let me through the door. Every time I went to interview young French Muslims, every single one of them said that they wanted to feel French, they wanted to belong, and indeed this was the country of their birth, similar to what you were talking about, Professor, around the beginning of this discussion. Every single one of them said this, okay? They were all the children of immigrants, like I am, like many of us are, yet the country, France, the state, will not allow these young people to feel French and to be French. And as I was walking around, you know, filming over a period of weeks, coming back and forth from the Eurostar to London, you know, after a long day of filming, I was actually quite stunned by the fact that, you know, the difference between what it means for me to be a European, despite Brexit, I'm still European, right? A European Muslim woman here in the UK, and what it means to be a European Muslim woman in France. And the difference is the difference between night and day. So right now, the French Senate is trying to ban the sports hijab. So this means that there's a further state-driven attempt to further minimize and erase Muslim women from public life, and that includes from sport. It's staggering that this is going on, right? There has been a lot of coverage here in the UK around it, but there hasn't been the level of solidarity that we should be seeing. And this solidarity is often missing when it comes to Muslim women in particular, and when it comes to our clothing choices. And I think it's really important to emphasize this. And when I've spoken to young French Muslim women activists and, you know, footballers and, you know, women who want to be involved in sport, they tell me about the extreme impact this is having on their mental health and well-being. And this is also in a country where it's very hard to access help. And this takes me on to the 3 hijabis. So last summer, myself and 2 of my friends and sisters, we all happen to be British women, happen to be Muslims. One sister is half Libyan, half English. One is Iraqi, and I'm of Pakistani heritage. We set up a petition within hours of the Euro final and the grotesque levels of racism that 3 young Black England football players were being subjected to. We set up a petition the following morning, and our petition called on the government and the FA and the tech companies to work together to ban racists from football. And within the space of 24 hours, we secured 1 million signatures. We also secured blanket media coverage all across the world, New York Times, Washington Post, you know, we were basically everywhere, okay? Now, if we were French and Muslim and, you know, and wear a headscarf like I am now, we would not have been able to do that in France, because of our visible Muslimness and our visible identity. We would not have been allowed to be in the political or public sphere as activists, as feminists, as sports fans. And I think that pretty much sums up what is going on in France. Now, there are many people here who believe that what's happening in France simply can't happen here. What I'll say is Islamophobia is thriving and is alive and well. I mean, Azeem has spoken to this in a very powerful way in relation to his experiences. And yet Islamophobia continues to be denied as a form of racism. It is a form of racism that still people sort of turn the other way and say Muslims are not a race. Now, Muslims are not a race, but we know that Muslims are pathologized as a race. And I think it's really important that when we talk about racism, we also talk about Islamophobia, just as we talk about anti-Semitism and we talk about all other forms of racism, but this is not happening. And when it comes to sport, this is definitely not happening. If we look at football, we have to look at the lack of progress football in all its ranks has failed to make in relation to representation, particularly of South Asian footballers from South Asian backgrounds, and also those of Muslim heritage. We're simply missing. We're completely invisible, and we have to ask why. And then when we get to cricket, obviously Azeem's far more qualified to talk about this than I am, but again, we're missing. We have to ask why. And there is this story, and the stories that have been told over many, many years by very disconnected members of the establishment, be they those men who are running cricket, be they those men who are running overwhelmingly football or any other form of sport, and those in government. They have these mythical stories that they keep telling about us without knowing anything about us. Now, I believe that sport is a very transformative space. And I also see a lot of really powerful and exciting things happening across the world and here in our country as well. And I think that the sport is actually on the front line now of tackling racism, tackling inequalities, and tackling all forms of structural bigotry. And for me, I see parallels with what's happening in the US and the way that many high-profile sportsmen and women have been almost forced into this space. You look at Naomi Osaka, for example. She has been completely vilified for having the audacity to speak about her mental health. The fact that she has been so open and so vocal and so honest and so vulnerable in talking about, what it means for her to be a Black woman, but one with mixed race identities. One of less than 3 Black women that we can think of in her area of sport. And look at how she's been treated. Look at how she's been ostracized. You look at the tennis player who decided to go to Australia and not abide by COVID rules. I mean, if she did that, the difference, the discrepancy in the treatment between him and her is just, there is just no comparison. And the same thing goes for Lewis Hamilton when he's gone on record to talk about mental health. I mean, I think these two individuals, and you as well, Azeem, have, you've created safety for many, many of us to be able to have conversations with our peers, with our family members about, issues around mental health. But I do think that we're in very serious and dangerous political times. We know that. We're in a situation where every day the impact of racism is being laid bare like never before. We've talked about COVID-19, the disproportionate impact on working class people of colour there's no denying that this is what's going on. Yet every single day, the denial is taking place from the top to the bottom, and the gaslighting is, ongoing. But I think the pushback is getting stronger, and this is what I want to focus on. And I'm going to end on this point. I think the fact that 3 British Muslim women can mobilise 1.2 million people, we can hold 2 very, quite frankly, horrifying meetings with the FA where their behaviours towards us were absolutely disgraceful. I do not believe that the FA would have had the audacity to treat us that way if we were 3 women, white women. They would have treated us in a very different way. We were told by people working inside sport who, reached out to us as this petition was taking a life of its own, that they said that they'd never seen Muslim women like us visible in this way, talking about sport. And I'd like to ask why. Why is that? Because, Muslim women love sport like many of us do. It's because we are not given that space. We are not allowed to own that space, right? So I see phenomenal pushback taking place. I see football in particular as a real vehicle for social change. We've seen it around food banks. We've seen it around, fighting poverty and discrimination. Am I sitting here telling you that football is a utopia? Absolutely, it's not. But things are definitely changing. I took my mum to Wembley for her first ever football match to watch the England Lionesses. She would never have gone, but she wanted to go because when I was doing this work around football, she discovered, I had to fess up to her and tell her that I spent a lot of time going to football matches, and I didn't tell her because she'd be terrified. She'd be scared of my safety. And even to this day, there are, you know, very diverse populations around football grounds that when a football match is on, we stay at home. We ring up our mums and our aunties and our sisters and our uncles, and we say, and our granddads and grandmas, please don't go out today, there's a football match on. This is a reality. I don't know, Azeem, this may also potentially apply to cricket as well, because cricket is not some sort of gentleman's club, as we know. But the point here is that I do think sport is a vehicle for change. I think this campaign, the Run Out Racism campaign, is really important, but I think we need to start campaigning on our own terms now. We need to see urgent change. We need to see transparency, and you know, we're not here to fade into the background. We're here to tell our stories, because our stories are part of the story of sports and part of the story of this country as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Shaista. I can agree with you more, and you know, thank you so much for sharing. You spoke at the beginning there, you know, about the missing solidarity for Muslim women. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but is there anything that you can point people to who are watching this, what they can do to kind of support Muslim women in sports?
Yeah,
kind of
I mean,
the
there's solidarity missing for Azeem as a Muslim man as well. And
Sure.
you know, I think you know, we're in a situation where people are being pitted against each other. So you know, if I want my equality, then I want Anne, I want Kevin, I want Azeem, I want Roxy, I want you to have your equality. We have to understand what's going on. So there's lots of links and things I can share in a moment in the chat. But basically, please get behind Les Hijabers. These are the French Muslim women who are campaigning against the Senate, trying to ban them from playing football. And just to be very clear, these are working class Black Muslim women from the suburbs who wear hijabs, and they are right at the front line of all the intersections of bigotry and resistance. And you know, full respect to them, and the fact that they've managed to do this in a country where women who look like them are not given any space is phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you so much, and please do share links that people can kind of follow through after this webinar is over. And yeah, an open invitation for anyone to share anything on the chat if they'd like us to amplify or support anything that's going on in their local areas. So yeah, please do share. So moving on, I'd like to speak to Kevin next. Similar to Azeem, you've been in the professional sporting world. Do you think there's a problem of racism in sport? And if so, how is that sustained, and how does it operate?
Yeah, I think there's a huge problem, and it probably starts before players get into sport. So I think, for example, when I was younger, so I mean, you know, I started at West Ham, but I went to Charlton, and Charlton, for those who don't know, the training ground's based in Eltham. So when I was traveling, I think I was at 13 or 14. I mean, back in the day, you'd hear Eltham was racist, but I was traveling as a youngster to Eltham, and I think it was 2 years after Stephen Lawrence had got murdered. So already the things that were going through my mind is different ways I have to get to and from training. And there were other things that I had to deal with, but I think there's a lack of awareness. So when Anne was talking earlier, and she was talking about other in terms of, you know, recording race, what was ringing in my head was different ways that we are othered as well. So yeah, so there was that. I think there's a lot of attention on racism in terms of the stadium. So I've done a lot of work for Kick It Out. I've done a lot of work for Show Racism the Red Card as well. So I'm very much aware of how the fight against racism is. I'm also very much aware of like all the things that are in place and how football operates and how they educate and how they challenge and all the things that happen. And when you asked me, Roxana, about what did I want to speak about, it's funny because actually there were so many things that came up when the others were speaking about, which I made some notes I wanted to respond to. But I originally said enablers, because when I look at it, all racism's bad. But if I look at, say, someone in the stadium shouting something at one of the players, that's bad. But when you look at things that happen in the training ground who are meant to be like your colleagues, for me, that's worse. And for a player, they can feel extremely powerless because they're stuck. So a lot of the times you're told to report it to, say, the governing bodies or the people in football. But the problem is that's going to then affect you because you'll get dropped. You probably won't get a new contract. Now, football's aware of this. but they don't provide any solutions. And I'm not saying it's easy to do that, but it's pretty much easy to say, oh, you know, if anything happens, tell us. But the truth of the matter is that unfortunately you have players who feel powerless, although they have the power, because one of the arguments, what I've always said is come together, don't isolate yourself. So if a player comes out and speaks out, if something happens, you're better off unifying, because, you know, if I play for a team, you know, Shaista plays for a team, Azeem plays for a team, Anne plays for a team, you play for a team, what happens is we can say, look, okay, this happened to, say, Roxana, and we're not happy. So we're going to do X, for example, but now we're as a collective. But because we're so talented and we're international players, we can then speak to our international colleagues who are also at different teams. All of a sudden, we are now pretty much locking down the Premier League, say La Liga, all the leagues around the world, if we utilize our network. So I think on one aspect, we've got to look at, say, the accountability from the players, because as much as I know we could say, you know, things shouldn't happen, history has told us that this has happened for years. And so I think that there has to be a way of, and I'm speaking more to football in terms of just kind of saying, look, we need to do more. But from the institution's perspective, and I've spoken out about this at events as well, it's unfortunately, there's a lot of talk around racism, but people use that as an opportunity for career progressions. So you would have, for example, talks, and you'll get like Sky Sports and BT Sports, and you get the panels and everyone's there and it's all promoted on social media. And I actually remember, and I said this in one of the talks, because I knew most of the people in the room. So you've got all like the journalists and everyone's like, yeah, the players should do this. And I said, well, we know what would happen if they speak, and we know why they don't speak. But I said to the broadcasters in the room, I said, well, why are you guys here? Because really and truly, the panelists of, say, Sky Sports and BT Sports are not going to turn around and say, oh, do you know what, guys? Yeah, we are racist. They're not going to do it. So what is this really about? Really, the stage was the audience. And when you looked at the audience, which I did, I put this question to them. I said, I know all of you, and I know that you've experienced racism within your job, right? But you don't speak about it. So how can you speak and say that these players need to speak when you guys aren't even dealing with it when it's in your face? And I'm saying, and I say that to say that, one, yes, that's an issue. But two, even if you don't speak, and you might have that fear, it's exploring as to why and working from there and progressing forward. So there are so many layers to it, but I think sometimes people would throw the mud from a distance. And the reason why I actually started to do some work with, say, Kick It Out and Show Racism, the Red Card, was around the time that Anton Ferdinand had got abuse from John Terry, and I was really frustrated about it. And I had my own issues with regards to racism in football anyway, but I thought I wanted to learn more about it so I had a stronger argument. So I can say this now because I've done a lot of work with, whether it be the Premier League, whether it be the Professional Football Association. So I can put an argument forward now, and football can't challenge it because I know football's offerings. I've been in their training and I've actually delivered it. So I can now put an argument for it. So, but yeah, I want to say that. Sorry, I want to get some notes because there was some really interesting stuff being said earlier. It was interesting when Azeem said about adjusting to the environment. So one of the things that I've done is delivered programs across the Premier League from under 10s all the way up to staff and to parents. And players talk about, one of the biggest things we talk about is banter. And I actually talk about this in my book. And with the boys, I had this where in a club up north, this was, by the way, under 13s, and all the players do it. They're like, yeah, you know what, man, we're good, man. No, everything's good. So I'm laughing because I say, look, you know I was in this environment, so I know the truth. And I would say, look, put your hands up if you've been angry, upset, or sad at the levels of banter. And I'll never forget this, that they put their hands up, and I signaled to one of the guys at the back, and he couldn't even speak. He just broke down crying. And then what happened was you could hear a pin drop, because I knew that's the reality of the room. And sometimes they would just be forthcoming. Sometimes they'll put their hand up. Sometimes I'd have to get them to write it down anonymously, and then we have the conversation. But all the age groups, there's a massive issue. And I've had it at other clubs where they hide behind the line. It's like, yeah, as long as you don't go past the line. So I get them to stand where this line is. And I say, you know, whether it be extreme, and long story short is, they all have their own perception of what the line is. And so, unfortunately, until that gets dealt with at a very specific level, in finer detail, it's always going to be there. And I think Dave Chappelle's quote for me is brilliant, and it speaks to what Azeem said, where I think it was what his mum said to me. She said, sometimes you've got to be the lion so you can be the lamb that you really are. And so a lot of times in football, you're getting a lot of harsh banter, a lot of aggression and all of this stuff, but really it's role play. Football is theatre. And that's why you see a lot of times on the pitch, everyone's always about to fight, but no one ever really fights. It's all role play. Sorry, this is going to be like just one more bit. There's so much interesting stuff I wanted to kind of make a note on here. And there's so much that I could relate to. And it also, Azeem also said something, he made reference to almost like a gated community. And sport's not going to change because a lot of people who make it to an elite level have been brought up in that space. So it suffers from bad parenting. So when I look at football, it's like very aggressive, it's very abusive, and it was never changing, even though all the problems were coming up. But about, I'm trying to think of the year now, I think it's around 2011, 2012. In football, you had the Elite Player Performance Program, which is known as the EPPP. And what that did, it kind of put in a requirement that said, look, you've got to have a psychologist, you've got to have sports scientists, you've got to record this data, you've got to do all these things. And that shifted culture. There's still a long way to go, but it was a big change because before that, you couldn't get into the football unless you were qualified. And that qualification was being a footballer. And it makes me laugh because really, you're just a talented kid who progresses through to be an adult. And then all of a sudden you have all the answers, which is ridiculous. So at the moment, football has progressed, but it's very limited and there's still a long way to go. And I can go into that, but that's for another day. Do you know what? I'm just trying to think. Do you know what? I'll leave it there because I said I made some more notes, but it's all right. I'll leave it there.
Are you sure?
Yeah,
you're on a roll. Okay, well, maybe on that note, we'll go to a wider Q&A. So yeah, if our attendees want to drop any questions via the Q&A function, please do feel free to do so. There were some that we got through email before the webinar started that I will just start with now. What advice would you give to others who are living with mental health issues that can arise from being a victim of racism? I don't know who wants to pick up on that first, if anyone.
Okay, I guess whether it arises from racism or otherwise, there are, I think that, you know, we were talking about it before we came on. There are resources out there that can help you. It's really good to identify the things that work for you and do more of them. But it's really also important to recognize when you need broader help than from friends and family and the things that you value will make you feel good. And, you know, and that's the things that we've talked about. It's things like difficulty sleeping, difficulty eating, really struggling to concentrate and not enjoying anything. You know, and those are times when you can seek help. But then one of the things we talked about was seeking help is not easy because, you know, historically services have been really underfunded. But I think it is really important to see your GP, to access some of the online places. And I think one of the things I wanted to add to what Kevin was talking about was all the things he was saying. We've just recently done a project on cyberbullying and what we call Bystander Intervention. And that's exactly what he's talking about. It's that acting as a collective. And then even if you're not brave enough to stand up with someone, so publicly, because you're worried about the impacts of that, it's showing them support, be that privately or publicly. And I guess the thing that's really striking me is having a real recognition of the burden of being a whistleblower. And you know, being a whistleblower is so powerful, and it is always one of those, you know, the beginning markers of change, I think, is seeing whistleblowers come forward. But I think, you know, really recognise the burden of that and how challenging it is.
Azeem, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I think on this seeking help, it's so challenging on so many different levels, because the little bit of help that I had sought, that got used against me as something, well, how can we be racist? Look, we did this. And this seeking help bit is so difficult, because actually you're opening yourself up to one more person. And then when generally a lot of people find it really difficult in how to deal with that. And I mean, everywhere I sort of went for help, I got more knockbacks. It got bigger, the pain got bigger. I went to the inclusivity and diversity board member, went and sat in his front room, went through everything, cried my eyes out, got out of his room, found out later, the minute I go out, he rang the club and told them everything. So this seeking help bit's so difficult. And I think it's important that we, at point that I felt like I got a little bit of help when I went to my GP. And that again shows that actually trying to seek help within a sporting environment. So sporting teams, you'll see it everywhere. When it's trending on social media, it's good to talk and all this. Honestly, these are just sporting teams, and a lot of institutions do a lot of this stuff just for PR, and that is frustrating. But I would say to anyone, go to your GP, because that's when I actually felt like someone who didn't care one bit about whether the team was doing well or whether what the issue was, just wanted to look after me as a human being.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And again, Azeem, thank you for showing that in such a powerful and open way. If you've got a GP who you can go and talk to, that is the best route, I think. I went to see my GP 4 weeks ago, and he helped me understand that my PTSD has been re-triggered by many things, including the conflict in Afghanistan and Ukraine. I'm a former aid worker. I've spent 20 years working with very vulnerable populations, but also he helped me understand that the racism in particular that I've been subjected to open levels of racism because of the campaigning and anti-racism work I do. And, he helped me piece this together. So I've actually been referred. I was first diagnosed with PTSD in 2005. It's taken up until now for me to get a referral to a specialist PTSD clinic, right? So I'm happy to share this here, because that one conversation with my GP, who happens to be, I'm sure you wouldn't mind me saying this, but a very posh white man who understands what's going on, changed so many things for me. It helped me understand so much. And so, actually tomorrow I've got my first referral. Okay, and I've said to you, Azeem, when I was hearing your testimony, everything was being re-triggered. So I think one of the best ways to do this is to go through the GP route, if you can do that. But also you can find a help online in your local areas. There are clinics and other specialist places you can self-refer to. And I think trust is such an important issue, and it's very hard to find safety and to be able to speak, knowing that, as you said, Azeem, that something could be weaponized against you, when really all you're doing is seeking help and doing the right thing. But there are people out there who are going to listen to you, are willing to listen to you. Also, if you are in a place of work, you should ask for, you don't actually have to speak to your people you work with, but you can maybe try and get counselling via an employee assistance program. There are helplines, there are things like that are set up where you don't have to give your name, where you can anonymously seek help. And I think one of the main things is that when you take the first step to trying to get help, you may get knockbacks and things, but it does become easier the more steps you take. And people will be, I think, amazed at the number of people out there who are getting help, be it if they're on medication or, whenever you talk to someone will turn around and say, well, I've been taking that medicine for 10 years and it's really helped me. And the issue here is that nobody wants to talk about mental health, particularly in communities of colour, because we know the stigma, we know the devastating impact it has if people find out. Okay, so I think one of the things I would like to see is a better peer-to-peer support, where we can all support each other, because ultimately people need to be listened to and they need help.
Thank you so much for that, for sharing that painful experience as well, Shaista. So thank you for that. Kevin, did you want to come in there, or should we move on to another question? Okay, perfect. We've had a question come through on the chat. Why are white peers often so afraid to speak out in support of teammates or colleagues who have experienced racism? I'm thinking particularly about Azeem's case, but I'm sure it is a wider issue.
I mean, I don't think it's just white peers. I mean, Kevin were talking about it, and I mean, if that's what it's like in football, that people do sort of speak to each other and then try and support, I can tell you from my experience that this is something that hurts me the most, is no one wanted to deal with it. No one wanted to speak up. For me, the people who were perpetrators, that was bad, but the bystanders hurt me the most, because some of them were my friends. Some of them I would have expected, and you know, even at times you want to try and be a little bit reasonable, or give a bit of leeway, and you think, oh, maybe they didn't understand it. And the environment, this is why I called it institutional racism, because it was so embedded that no one thought it was wrong. Even good people didn't see anything wrong with it. But it for me, the biggest thing was around the loss of my son. Even at that point, everyone knew that how I was being treated was wrong. I've got messages from lads just saying to me, I can see you don't get any help at training. Can I help you? Like, but it's like, can someone stand up to these bullies, these racist people? Like, that's what I wanted. That's what I was looking for. But it wasn't just, there was people of color as well. And as well, this is something I want to talk about in a little bit more detail, which hasn't come through. There's been a lot of people of colour, and this is where it becomes a system, that have supported Yorkshire County Cricket Club in trying to cover this up. And I don't think this will come as a surprise to most people. Actually, most of my support has come from white people. And that hurts, that incredibly hurts, because when you talk about institutional racism, it's within the system, there's so many layers of protections. And then for the institution to go, well, how can we be racist? We work with National Asian Cricket Council, for example. Well, we can't be racist. We have this Muslim charity that comes in. But actually, what happens within that dressing room, only the players know, and no one else comes near that dressing room. And it's so difficult. And that's where it's so important the bystanders actually build up the courage to not look the other way, because that one mate, stop it, that's not acceptable, can make a big difference. So I don't think it is just a white peers thing. I think it's everyone, and we've all got a role to play in it. And from a cricketing point of view, it's in a really, but I mean, football is a lot further than cricket is. Cricket's in a lot further behind, and it's for everyone. Somewhere, everyone's got to take some responsibility, because we've all not done enough.
Yeah, I just, again, thank you, Azeem, for just speaking the truth. You know, white supremacy is a system that benefits many people, not just white people. And it's also a system that ultimately destroys all of us, right? And like you, Azeem, throughout my career, the support I've received is primarily from white liberals and primarily from straight white men. This is a fact, because part of white supremacy means only one person of colour can go through the gate. And we've got to basically tear chunks off each other to make sure that, you know, that individual is that individual. So this is all part of white supremacy structures. And, you know, the gaslighting, I mean, some of the most disgraceful aspects of what was going on in this country last year was these, you know, MPs of colour lining up to say that taking the knee was a political gesture, and, you know, Priti Patel gaslighting Tyrone Mings, and, you know, and Johnson standing up saying, well, in Parliament saying, you know, Priti Patel suffered racism. What an utter disgrace. Anti-blackness is anti-blackness, and Priti Patel does not get a get out of jail free card because she's a brown woman. And this is pretty much what I had to say on live public, you know, on television and radio. And this is what happens when real conversations start taking place about racism, because very rarely do we have real conversations taking place that focus on mental health and physical health and well-being. And I think one of the main reasons, though, we've got to be very clear, one of the main reasons why white people do not want to do this work is because they see what happens to us What happens to people of colour? You lose your income, you lose your career, you lose your friends, you would lose your mental health, you lose your physical health, you're accused of being a liar, you're gaslighted. Who wants to line up and queue up for that? Who's going to say, yeah, I'm going to sign up to that? Very few people, which is why what the England team did last year, what Gareth Southgate did in his phenomenal leadership, was show up what has been going on in this country for decades and decades and decades, the total denial of racism. And it took a multiracial England football team to take on this government's culture wars and to basically, set it adrift, right? And I think that I think is that was a really incredibly powerful moment in relation to race in this country. And we need to see people showing solidarity. Be it the fans, be it members of the board, be it the players. And the final thing I'm going to say is, I'm sure I'm not the only person here, but often I get people contacting me privately to say, oh, I'm really sorry that happened to you, or I'm really sorry this happened to you. And I've got to a point now where I'm like, please don't contact me. Don't contact me privately. If you have something to say it loud, say it proud, because this type of so-called solidarity is just really cowardice. And I think we have to be compassionate and find ways to bring people together, because overwhelmingly, I think people just don't know what to do. And I've spent most of my life wondering why people don't know what to do. I've stopped wondering now, because I feel that actually where people do want to make change, we've got to help them. But people in these positions of power should not be there unless they want to do the work. And we should be able to call them out without it turning into a slanging match. And we should ask for accountability and transparency.
Just to add to those, so I think good leadership is really important. We've talked a lot about peers. Good leadership is absolutely fundamental. I think another side of looking at people from similar backgrounds to all of us who don't speak up is, I do think that, and I think it's the same in terms of sexism, is it can be very difficult for people to recognise their experiences because it's so challenging. And so it's almost easier to deny it. So I don't think it's all negative. Sometimes it's about people's own hurts, makes it difficult to speak out. And the final thing I wanted to say is, I absolutely agree about people, speak out rather than speak privately. But actually, sometimes for some people, those private contacts do help. So, whichever way you feel empowered to reach out to someone, do it.
I mean, I was just going to go the same thing as Anne just said of leadership, that Gareth Southgate showed how good leadership can make such a big difference in this space. And I mean, Kevin's from football, so he can talk about it a little bit more than I, but from the outside, he looked like someone who got it, and someone who understood it and tried to educate himself by speaking to people, not just going into a classroom and doing a unconscious bias training and say, look, I know what to do. And also, just finally, on Anne said, I don't want it to sound negative. I always said I can live with people who are scared of the system. I can live with people who don't want to get involved. That's fine. The thing that hurt me the most is actually people try to take advantage of it by siding with the system to benefit themselves and their organizations. And one of my biggest sort of hate throughout this whole thing is these, and some are good, but community organizations, because majority of them left me high and dry and continue to leave me high and dry, but yet in the background try and benefit out of it for themselves. And for me, I don't know, and I'm interested in other views in this, is I feel like these are exactly the things that ends up giving the protection to these institutions. Why shouldn't they deal with it themselves? They can have advice and stuff, no problem, but why should they hand over BAME community to, here, this is your problem, now you deal with it? An institution like the ECB, who's had National Asian Cricket Council, why should we be separated? Because for me, that is the first route to separation and the first route to the problem. Because why can we not just have a room in the same office? Why can't the same employees make a difference for us as well? And if that means that you don't have a diverse enough employees, then get people within your office. Don't tell us to go and separate ourselves and go set up a new office. So, I mean, I think that's really important that we talk about that stuff, because it is uncomfortable. People are not going to like it. People are going to get defensive about it. But it's important, if we're challenging and trying to do the right thing, that we challenge everything and not just a few things.
No, 100%. Yeah, and thank you everyone for those really, really interesting reflections and remarks. I'm just going to do a final question, if that's okay with everyone. So it is, what would the panel say we as parents should say to our young people of colour to help them overcome and challenge racism in sport, so that they aren't lost to whatever sport it is they are engaged with? Don't know who wants to come in first there.
I'll go first.
Go on, Azeem.
This is something I've been asked. This is something I've been asked several times. It's difficult, because why would I want to plant the seeds of seeds of challenge, seeds of negativity into my baby? Because that's what it is. So it's a really difficult one. And I mean, last time I got asked, I just said I actually would try and make sure I'm supporting in and being and watching them develop and grow. We've got busy schedules. I wouldn't leave my son or daughter, if they're getting into sport, just leave them there and not watch what's happening. And I think that'd be the way I would support. I actually wouldn't try and put negative seeds in their head at the start. And then hopefully you have that space where you're there, you can watch it. And if there's things that do come up, then you can talk about it in a lot more of a safer and a calmer manner. I wouldn't want to put negative stuff into my babies.
I was just say, following on from that, I think it'd be worth speaking to the coach, so that if something does happen, that there's a set plan in place that everyone knows where they stand. Because a lot of the time in sport, what happens is, you know, a team might say, okay, look, we're against it. But when something happens, there's no plan in place. And then that could lead to further exposure. So I think it's really important, talking from a football aspect. Sometimes when I speak to players, you know, I would say get a plan in place. For example, if you're going to walk off the pitch, but don't assume anything. And funnily enough, I remember training with one of the governing bodies in football, and they actually said, they said, you know, and this is like a hypothetical question. So they said, oh, you know, if footballers are if they ask you if they should walk off the pitch, what should you say? And the training was basically trying to allude to for me and everybody else to tell the players not to walk off. And my argument was, I'm not in a position to tell them what to do, but my personal beliefs, I would say, for me, is walk off the pitch, because that's when it hurts money. But yeah, so going back to that, I would say as a parent, speak to the coach about having a plan. So that means for the young people and for the parents, everyone now knows if something does happen, there's that collective kind of assurance that, okay, I know this is going to happen. As they get older, I think it's for them. So if they're like late teens, they can kind of formulate their own plan, and that's for the players themselves. But I think don't leave it up to chance and don't assume anything.
Did anyone else want to come in there?
I guess just picking up on what Azeem said. So a few years ago, I remember thinking, God, I wish when I was younger, I had this language to put around experiences that I had. And I was in a panel with young people. I said, I'm almost jealous that, you know, these things that have happened to you, you have a language to talk about it now. I never did. But then as we carried on talking, we had this thing about, if you constantly recognize it, if you plant those seeds, what impact will that have compared to people like me who sort of didn't really know what was going on. And so I think we do have to think and be careful and look at what the impacts might be of the language that we use with young people. And I think that advice about talking to the coach and having a plan, as I've got older, I think that upfrontness about how will this be managed is almost always positive. Because I think sometimes when these things happen, the heightened emotions mean that if people haven't thought about it beforehand, it doesn't get handled well.
Yeah, I think the key to this is solidarity and everyone understanding that anti-racism is everyone's business. It's not just for people of colour, it's for everyone. And if we can be loud and proud anti-racist, then we can root out all forms of bigotry, homophobia, you know, everything. But it all starts with anti-racism. And really, there should be no space or place in particularly in sport at any level for this bigotry to thrive. And I think more and more people are, I think, starting to have those conversations, and they're trying to understand how they can be better anti-racist, how they can be better allies. And also for those of us who are not going to play sport at any level, or, you know, maybe we're nurturing children or, you know, others in our community to play, then I think what we need to do is make sure that we're visible and present in the different structures in sport. So, for example, I've been a governor at a primary school in Oxford for a number of years, and there is a sprinkling of diversity on those governing bodies, but very rarely is that the case in most schools that I've come across. And we have to make it our business to be in these spaces to make change. And so when, you know, children in particular are being treated in very particular ways because they might be racially profiled or their faith-based identity is what is being focused on, you know, those of us in the room can challenge that. And that's not an easy thing to do, but the more we do it and the more we build that solidarity, the more change will happen. And so this isn't just specific to sport. I think it goes across the board, right? Yeah, and, you know, I'll finish up just by saying that in this country is known for its passive aggressiveness. It is known for being obsessed with class and, you know, where are you from, where are you really from, and all these types of things. And I think what we have to do is we have to get working class children in particular to understand that your place is everywhere. Okay, just because you haven't seen anyone looks like you in that place, if you want to be there, the rest of us are going to support you as best we can, and we're going to be there to listen to you and to make change with your peers. And it sounds quite simple, doesn't it, right? And quite idealistic, but it works. And that's what I think we have to show up, and we have to be upfront about what our values are and how we want to make change.
I'd really like to support that idea of being out there. So I've recently become a school governor, and I'm sure its composition reflects exactly what you were talking about. But I think it's putting ourselves in those spaces. And I think the thing that it benefits for those of you here that are quite young is it teaches you leadership skills. So it's a two-way street. But I think that thing of being recognisable and visible, both for young people, but in those spaces for others, is really important. Absolutely.
And a really positive note to end on, I think. Solidarity is key, and get yourselves out there. So yeah, thank you so much to our panel. It was a really interesting discussion, and thank you for taking the time out on your Tuesday evening to join us. Thank you to our attendees. I will be sending a link to this recording, so yeah, please do feel free to share with your family and friends if they weren't able to join us. And if you are interested in any of this work, Hope Not Hate are running a Run Racism Out training program that's specifically designed for cricket clubs, you know, and we cover the grassroots as well. So if you've got a cricket team in your area and you want some free anti-racism training, then drop me an email. If you've got any more questions about any of these topics as well, yeah, again, my email is kind of open to all. So yeah, please do feel free to get in touch.